Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker has been at Pandemic, iWin, Sony Online Entertainment. She's been making free-to-play games since 2006, which is 1 year less than me, but she's twice as smart as I am. So, if we take 8 years of free-to-play game development times 2 for twice as smart, she's the only person on the planet who can claim 16 years of experience in free-to-play gaming. She'll be competing in the Evil Game Design Challenge later today. Ladies and gentlemen, the brilliant Laralyn MCWILLIAMS.
Thank you. So I apologize in advance if I get a little breathless during this. It's not nerves, so I'll just talk through it. So the origin for this is kind of the aftermath of a talk that I did at GTC Next about metrics and how they're not necessarily the bottom line in terms of understanding your players. So in the course of creating that talk, I realized that a lot of free-to-play games treat customers in a way that would be absurd outside of that environment. And one of the examples I gave is that when I buy something on Amazon, they thank me. Have you ever been thanked in a free-to-play game in any meaningful way when you make a purchase? And in fact, they thank me twice when I buy something in Amazon. So what happens when I buy something in Candy Crush, which is a great game, by the way. I played the crap out of it, so I'm only using it as an example because I had screenshots. So what happens when I make a purchase in Candy Crush? I continue to get inundated with more and more requests to make purchases, right? There's no thanking me anywhere in that process. And really, as I thought about that, I thought, you know, if you were treated that way when you went to a restaurant, if they brought you your appetizer and then continued to pester you to buy more and never said thank you, would you keep going to that restaurant? I don't think you would. And around the same time, I was asked 2 really good questions. And this is the first one, which is, how do you know when you're making players unhappy before they leave the game? And the second one was, how do you convince leaders at your company who are driven by metrics that something fuzzy like player happiness really matters? And those were the 2 questions that framed this talk. So around the same time, I realized I needed to get new glasses. And I started thinking about what it's like when you go to the optometrist. So when you go to the optometrist, he looks at your eyes through devices, and then he changes your prescription based on what he sees. And also, after that, you go into a room where there's someone who helps you pick out frames that look good for you, right? And that's the experience of going to the optometrist. So when you think about the experience that you have when you go to the optometrist, everyone who's ever had their eyes examined or worn glasses or contacts knows wearing that, you know, looking through that device, and the optometrist is saying, which one do you like better, 1 or 2, 1 or 2, A or B? And over the course of asking you those questions and looking at his own readings, he develops your prescription. And then you go and the person helps you and is, how about this frame? Do you like that one? That one's not great for you. How about this one? So now imagine if you went to the optometrist and he just looked at the machines, wrote down your prescription, you went out and someone handed you frames, and they basically said, you're going to wear what I tell you to wear and you're going to like it. And that effectively is how we're treating our players in free-to-play games. If you think about the optometrist, it's a partnership. He's using his scientific expertise, but he's also taking the time to ask you how your experience is. And certainly that's the case when you try on your frames. So when you think about that, the optometrist and you have the same goal, which is to help you see better. But the optometrist has a second goal, which is to make you a happy customer who comes back to him the next time you need glasses. And that started to make me think about the way we interact with players in free-to-play games. Because really, it's a partnership there, too. Between the numbers that we use to make decisions about whether we're getting the results we want and the player's getting the results he wants, but also how the players behind the screen feel about their experience. And it's something that's difficult for them to convey to us. It matters just as much, though, as the metrics themselves. And metrics are hard to use to understand how players feel. They don't really capture emotions. So this talk is intended to open up a conversation between us today and between you and your company and the other people that you work with and the leaders at your company when you go back from the conference. So when you start trying to talk about metrics and player happiness, it's really difficult, right? There's no measuring spoon for love. There's no way to understand that in terms of, you can't quantify it, right? We look for symptoms of happiness. Retention is one of those symptoms, but retention is not the same as happiness. We all know, if you think about it, you do a lot of things over and over again for a long time that you don't like, right? You stick with TV shows that are not entertaining you anymore for a while because you want to see if it gets better, and you kind of are invested in it, and you may not like it, but you stick around for a while, right? So retention doesn't mean happiness. It means your game is sticky. It means they're playing your game. It doesn't necessarily mean that they like it. So yeah, this is a hard problem to solve. And trying to use metrics and trying to be on the other side of the screen and figuring out what players like is like climbing a wall. Because you're trying to find safe handholds. You're looking for a path. You're looking for the way that will help you get to the answer. And to be honest, I believe our best practices as an industry make that even harder. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So how can we start to get at this information? Well, forums are not, the total picture for two reasons. We all know only a minority of players post in the forums. You'll hear different stats. Some people say under 10%. It's probably under 5%. Sometimes it's 1%. If it's kids, under 13, it's 0%, right? They can't post to the forums. But the other thing to keep in mind is, even for the players who post to the forum, they represent a very specific personality type. It's the type of person who, when they get bad service at a restaurant, will ask to talk to the manager about it, right? How many of us would do that? Not very many. We're not that kind of person. The forum poster is that kind of person. So if you cater just to what the forum posters say, you're only catering to one of your personalities in the game, and you're ignoring your average player. So if you can't listen to forums, how do you get into players' heads? And how do we know what they're thinking? Well, one of the ways we try to do that is with A/B tests, but I'm going to challenge an assumption here about A/B tests. So we all know how it works. We put apple and orange out there. You run the test for a while, a couple weeks, a month. You pick the one that has the best result. The best result can be defined as increases retention or increases monetization without decreasing retention, or sometimes increases monetization with an acceptable loss in retention, which is sad but true. But really what happens when you run an A/B test is that after you release it, you're not just talking about that A/B test now, because you've been running other A/B tests, and you run more after that, and you're making other changes that aren't a part of an A/B test. You're releasing new content. All of those things together are the sum of a player. So while we like to think, we look at the metrics and, he's player Apple. That's what he got. Really, after about a couple months in your game, every player looks like this. They're a Frankenstein of all the A/B tests that they've ever had, along with all the changes that you've made and how they felt about those changes and their relationships with other players. It's not as simple as we like to think it is. So even though you might see results in an A/B test and make decisions on it, and those are good decisions for that one A/B test, it doesn't mean they're a good decision for the game as a whole. So instead of talking about best practices, let's talk about tools. Let's talk about how we can start to understand our players. Because if you're going to climb the mountain, you may not know what you're going to face on the mountain that day, but you can certainly prepare yourself for whatever happens. So I'm going to talk about a tool that I use for this, and then some other examples. So Professor McTackey here has a great flaming sword, and he had to beat the boss 3 or 4 times to get it. So let's say he posts to the forum, I ran the dungeon 6 times and finally got the flaming sword of awesome, and it's lame. It does less damage than my old sword. So when I think about how we made the flaming sword of awesome, some things went into it. Some numbers went into it for damage, and you have to be level 5 to equip it, and the attack speed, and whether it does a dot or an AoE, right? All of those numbers went into it. And what also went into it was the model and the texture and the effects and the attack effects and audio and a whole bunch of other things. And when you think about it, those are 2 categories now. There's function and there's feel. And it's a distinct difference between those 2 categories. So let's look at his statement. Flaming Sword of Awesome is lame. That's feel. Let's say you look at the stats, and it actually does less damage than other weapons in its class. That's the function. So at that point, you think, OK, I've got an easy way to fix this. The player's right. He pointed something out to us. But let's say the opposite is true. Let's say you look at the Flaming Sword of Awesome, and it's actually doing more damage. The guy's totally wrong about what he's saying. I think a lot of times our tendency as game designers, especially in the day of metrics, is to say, OK, problem solved. He's wrong. But that's ignoring the fact that that is still a problem. He thinks the sword is lame, even if he's wrong. You can't post on the forum, no, the metrics say you're right. He's still going to think it's lame, right? How can I address that feeling? Well, one way to go about it is to go back to this. I can change those things and help it feel more awesome when he uses it, right? And you can even start to change the numbers to get at the feel. So let's say he's hitting an enemy with the Sword of Awesome, and he sees 100 damage fly up, and he's like, that's lame, my other sword did 120. We know as game designers that the difference is it's putting a fire effect that hits for 5 every second, for 5 seconds. So it actually is more powerful than the other sword, but he's not getting it. Maybe you make a change so it does more damage on hit. So he sees a big 120 pop up, and he's like, it's better, right? It's a balance issue. You can balance in a way that feels better to him. And that's one way to start to get at it. But the point is that it's a mix of logic and emotion that goes into our decisions as game designers. And it's why we can never design just by metrics, because that ignores the emotional and the feel side of what the player's experience is. So let's talk about another problem with metrics and looking at retention to measure happiness is it's reactive. You really can't measure retention until someone leaves, if you think about it, right? You measure their retention, they're staying with you, and then they leave. And at that point, it's too late to do anything. So how can we be more proactive about assessing how happy our players are? And this is a really hard problem to solve. So I'll nudge that up front. It is not as easy as saying, we'll just make them happy, we'll just give them more stuff. It's not that easy. It's a hard problem to solve. So how can you get at it? Candy Crush Saga has this meter that pops up after you play certain levels. So it's catering it's still got the forum problem, right? I bet a lot of people just leave it in the middle and hit OK or escape out of it, right? And you can't tell me that they're not tying those results to a whole bunch of things, right? Like what A/B test is that person in, and how long has he been playing, and what does he do after that? Did he just make a purchase, right? So they're trying to get more information out of this, but that's still a pretty limited way to look at it. You can form a panel of players. So the Big Fish folks had the Big Fish Babes, which was an informal panel. The panel kind of formed itself. SOE has an influencer summit they run every year, where they invite the most hardcore players and guild leaders and bloggers to come talk about the game with them. They also have player panels at Fanfare. It's a mistake just to do that with whales, though. When I see this used in social games, it's most often just talking to their whales about what can we do to make you happy. And that's a mistake, because they're kind of already happy. They're spending money with you. How do you get more people to be happy enough to spend money with you is the question. But making a player panel is an interesting way to do that. But here's something easy. How about we start thanking people when they make a purchase? You could do that today in your game. It's an easy change. How about taking it one step further, and after they make a purchase, instead of where you would pop up another offer to purchase, you pop something thanking them for being a loyal customer? How about every 5 purchases you give them a bonus? That you say, thank you, we're giving you an extra power-up with this pack because you're a loyal customer and we value you. That's something that we could start doing today. Because honestly, when you think about win-back messaging, which is one of the big ways we try to get players back when they stop playing our games, that's too late. Shouldn't you be treating your customers like that all the time before they leave your game? So another way to think about it, there's a great couple articles on Gama Sutra that I really recommend about predictive metrics. So you see this used a lot of times by casino games to predict people who are going to spend. But we could also use that to try to just understand how players are happy with their games. And basically what you want to do is you want to find a player who quit and start doing archaeology. Trace that guy's steps. Look for patterns. He had a pattern. Games are habits. Games are hobbies. You tend to play them the same way, the same days. See where his pattern broke. See where she started to play less. See where she stopped talking to her friends. Look for a pattern. See if you can find that pattern in more people. Look beyond retention. Look at what they're doing. How many times are they sharing with friends? How many times are they making purchases? How many times, what are their status of their timers? Do you see this pattern start to begin when the timers in the game are making people wait 24 hours instead of 12 hours? Can you find a pattern? And that starts to tell you where people are unhappy. And once you find that pattern, Then you can start retention win-back messages before they start to leave instead of after they leave. You can spontaneously make them offers. You can say, I detect this person is starting the pattern of churn. I'm going to start trying to get him not to churn and to understand why he did. But don't make the mistake of finding when the pattern starts and assuming it was the previous update that did it, because player unhappiness is a slow poison. Like I said, we all stick with things that frustrate us that we don't like all the time. Eventually we quit, but we don't quit. It's rarely a rage quit, right? I doubt that Game of Thrones' Red Wedding really made people stop watching the show, right? It made people angry, and maybe they will stop watching the show. Maybe it'll take them 3 or 4 episodes to just say, all right, F this, right? But I bet they didn't stop after that show, even if it triggered them to stop eventually. So yeah, this is a super hard problem to solve, and it involves a conversation. And I have more time open for questions at the end of this than most talks, because I want this to be a conversation about what we can do. But honestly, the first thing we can do is agree that we need to change as an organization, as a group, that we need to start acknowledging our players and thanking them for purchases and trying to figure out more about how to make them happy in our games. Because I maintain that this is crazy bullshit. It's absurd that that's the lifetime of players in our games. And the reason I say that's absurd is because of games like this. So EverQuest is going into its 14th year as a profitable online game. There are lots of games, World of Warcraft. There are lots of free-to-play games, League of Legends, who are holding players for years. And yet the vast majority of us are not. And it's time that we start thinking about why we're not and how we can start to change the patterns that we're in that are creating the behaviors in our players that make them quit. And ultimately, it's a win-win when we get to the top of that mountain, because our players are happy, and that means they're staying with us, and they're probably spending more money with us, which is good for us. So it's in our best interest to do this too, and to take the time to figure out how to solve this problem. So, questions?
Laralyn, that was a truly, truly excellent talk. Thank you for that. I don't know if you've ever gotten this before, but I'm thinking finish Steve Jobs. So I don't have, I'm entrepreneurial. I don't have 600,000 euros to pay IDEO to scour the globe and a team of behavioral psychologists to interview potential customers or my current customers. I know I'm going to have to do a lot of the qualitative testing myself. Where do I get started? How do I, where do I start learning about qualitative testing and administering qualitative tests and how to interview my customers, et cetera, et cetera?
So there are a lot of great articles on Gama Sutra. I definitely recommend the series about trying to predict when players will churn. But one thing I did want to mention, I wanted to mention in my talk and I totally forgot, is when I was at Steam Dev Days, there was a really interesting bid about how they monetize Team Fortress 2 and Dota 2. And the Dota part was really interesting because they took the time to, but basically their process at Valve is that when they have a purchase that a player can make, they start, even with themselves, measuring whether there's any regret from that purchase. The day of and for months afterward, they'll continue to ask, are you happy with that purchase? Do you regret it? If there's any regret, they stop it right then. Done. They won't make people purchase that thing. And it goes so far as if there's something that they think makes a player unhappy or is a poor customer experience, they will not consider doing it. They don't care how much money it makes. And so that line of reasoning led them to have, for example, boosts in Dota 2, that the boosts in Dota 2 don't just boost you during a match, they boost everybody on both teams. So everybody is super happy you made a purchase. So it's not that Dick paid his way to win. But thank you for having that power up. Gifts are some of the top things that they sell, where the person who bought the gift gets nothing, but he gives gifts to other players. And he feels great about giving gifts. The people who got the gifts feel great. And what was disappointing to me after that talk, because it was phenomenal information, and hopefully they make those videos available to everybody. But what really struck me after that was when I had conversations about that with people in the free-to-play space, I got this knee-jerk response of Valve can afford to do that. Sure, Valve can afford to do the research. Their findings are valid for the rest of us. And so to answer your question, one of the ways that you can get more involved in player happiness is to look for the companies that have happiness as one of their primary values and try to emulate what they're doing. Because the answer is, they have the pockets to do the experimentation, to do the experimentation that leads to their results. Their results are valid for us. You don't have to have the deep pockets of Valve to make purchases that make players happy. None of us have the, I don't think many of us, there may be a few people in the room who are at big enough companies, but most of us don't work for companies that have the room to do that kind of experimentation and to terminate something the minute it makes someone unhappy, right? We can't afford to do that, but they can. So let's follow what they do. Let's really closely look at what they do. Not in terms of understanding that exactly what they do will be successful for us, because that's never the case, but to understand how they're able to keep their players happy. And if you watch the things that they do and the things that they take back at companies like Valve, they'll put it out and then they'll be like, no. Then you can start to get a sense of where they're seeing players aren't happy and apply that knowledge to your own game.
Yeah, if you're not qualitative testing at every step in development, you're doing something wrong, and you don't need to spend a lot on it. Sometimes it's as cheap as like buying people a pizza and some Diet Coca-Cola. Watch your players play with the game, talk to them. You can record their face, the screen,
yes,
the input, sync those up and watch and say they're frowning here, et cetera, et cetera. Qualitative testing is just as important.
Find players
as
who play your game
testing
in your town and have them come in and say, well, we just want to talk to you about what you think.
Any questions for the Finnish Steve Jobs, ladies and gentlemen? Toy.
We at Ubisoft are currently thinking, doing an approach where we just rename the whole thing. Because internally we have the metric, the customer acquisition, the monetization, everything is just like a customer, money, 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 and somehow people forget that actually we are in the online game business. So we try the approach that in the normal life game business we rename the player to be a fan. So the paying user is a fan, and a fan has to be serviced. And this is a very different approach because suddenly you think differently. Because most people who go there suddenly see the metrics and see how it works, are only thinking about monetization, and this is it. They never think about the human being who actually made a purchase and want to be happy.
Yes, I agree, and there's a reason I use the word customer several times in my talk. Not just players, they're customers, and we need to treat them that way.
Man, we should have had a session which is just Toot and Laralyn talking to each other all day. I could listen to that all day. It just so happens they're both up next in the Evil Game Design Challenge. We have time for one more question. Anybody? Thank you so much, Laralyn.